March 9, 1974, Lubang Island, Philippines. A man emerges from the jungle. He's 52 years old but looks ancient, emaciated, weathered, hardened by decades of survival. He wears a tattered Japanese Imperial Army uniform that's been hand-repaired thousands of times. He carries a functioning Aichi rifle, ammunition he's hoarded for 30 years, and a samurai sword that's never been surrendered. This is Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda, and he's about to surrender. 29 years after World War II ended, 29 years after Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's defeat, 29 years of fighting a war that no longer exists. This is the story of the last Japanese holdout, the soldier who refused to believe the war had ended, who killed 30 people defending an island that didn't need defending, who followed orders so completely that he couldn't comprehend those orders were obsolete. This is how one man's dedication became one man's delusion, and how loyalty turned into tragedy for everyone involved. The story begins 3 decades earlier, December 1944. Hiroo Onoda was a young intelligence officer in the Imperial Japanese Army, trained in guerrilla warfare at the Nakano School, Japan's elite intelligence academy. Unlike regular infantry who were taught to die gloriously in banzai charges, Nakano graduates were taught to survive, to blend in, to wage war from the shadows for years if necessary. Onoda excelled at this training. He learned jungle survival, propaganda techniques, sabotage operations, and most critically, he learned absolute obedience to orders regardless of circumstances. In December 1944, Onoda received his assignment. He would deploy to Lubang Island in the Philippines with orders to conduct guerrilla operations against American forces, to never surrender under any circumstances, and to continue fighting until Japan achieved final victory or until he received direct orders to cease operations from his commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi. These orders were crystal clear, absolutely unambiguous. Fight until personally ordered to stop by Major Taniguchi. No one else's orders mattered. No surrender appeals, no leaflets, no announcements. Only Major Taniguchi could release him from this mission. Onoda understood these orders completely. He arrived on Lubang Island in early 1945 with a small unit of soldiers. Their mission was to delay American operations, destroy the airstrip, sabotage supplies, and generally make life difficult for any occupation forces. The American invasion of Lubang came in February 1945. Onoda's unit fought briefly, then melted into the jungle as trained. Most of his comrades died in the initial fighting or surrendered within weeks. By mid-1945, only 4 Japanese soldiers remained in Lubang's jungle: Onoda, Corporal Shimada, Private Kozuka, and Private Akatsu. These 4 men would become the longest holdouts of World War II. August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. The war ended. Japan lost. Everyone knew this, except the 4 men hiding in Lubang's jungle. They heard the announcement. Leaflets dropped from aircraft informed them the war was over. Japan had surrendered. They should come out and go home. Onoda read these leaflets carefully. He analyzed them thoroughly. His conclusion? American propaganda. Psychological warfare designed to make them surrender. Everything about the leaflets seemed wrong to Onoda. The paper quality was too good. The Japanese language was too formal. The entire message seemed designed to trick them into surrendering. Onoda had been trained to recognize propaganda. This was obviously propaganda. Therefore, the war must still be ongoing. Therefore, his mission continued. This logic made perfect sense to Onoda. He had been ordered to ignore surrender appeals. He had been ordered to continue fighting until Major Taniguchi personally ordered him to stop. These leaflets weren't from Major Taniguchi. Therefore, they were irrelevant. The four holdouts continued their mission. They raided Filipino farms for food, occasionally exchanged fire with police, and generally tried to make themselves useful to what they believed was the ongoing Japanese war effort. The Filipinos who encountered them tried explaining the war was over. The holdouts didn't believe them. Why would they believe the enemy? Of course the enemy would lie. Of course this was psychological warfare. The mission continued. The years passed. 1946, 1947, 1948. The holdouts remained in the jungle. They survived on stolen rice, bananas, coconuts, and occasionally slaughtered livestock. They maintained military discipline. Onoda was the ranking officer, so the others followed his lead. He led them on raids, organized their camp, maintained their weapons, and most importantly, maintained their belief that Japan was still fighting and would eventually win the war. This belief was essential. Without it, their suffering was meaningless. With it, they were loyal soldiers carrying out their duty. Onoda needed that belief. His entire identity was built on it. In 1950, Private Akatsu surrendered. He walked out of the jungle, turned himself in to Filipino authorities, and went home to Japan. The three remaining holdouts were shocked. Akatsu had betrayed them, betrayed Japan, betrayed everything. They vowed never to make the same mistake. They would continue fighting. They would remain loyal. They would never surrender. Akatsu tried telling the authorities about the other three still hiding in the jungle. The Philippine government launched search operations. They sent soldiers into the jungle calling for the holdouts to surrender. They dropped more leaflets. They brought Akatsu's family to the island to plead for them to come out. Nothing worked. Onoda and the others saw all of this as increasingly sophisticated American propaganda. The war must be going very badly for Japan if the Americans were trying this hard to make them surrender. They would fight harder. They would resist more. They would never give up. The 1950s became routine for the three remaining holdouts. They had established their patterns about where to camp, where to hide, how to raid effectively without getting caught. They became masters of jungle survival. They knew every trail, every water source, every good hiding spot on the entire island. The Filipino police occasionally tried hunting them, but these operations usually failed. The holdouts were too experienced, too careful, too well trained. They simply disappeared into the jungle whenever danger approached. But their guerrilla activities had real consequences. They weren't harmless survivors hiding from embarrassment. They were armed combatants who believed they were fighting a war. They killed Filipinos they perceived as threats. They burned crops they thought supported enemy operations. They destroyed property they classified as military targets. To the Filipinos, these were murders and crimes. To Onoda and his men, these were legitimate military operations in an ongoing war. This disconnect would eventually result in 30 Filipino deaths and hundreds of injuries over the decades of Onoda's holdout. In 1954, Corporal Shimada was shot and killed by search parties. His death devastated the two remaining holdouts. Onoda and Kazuka had lost another comrade. They held a small military funeral for Shimada, buried him in the jungle, and vowed to continue the mission in his honor. They were now down to 2 men, but 2 men could still fight. 2 men could still conduct operations. 2 men could still matter in this war that they believed was still being fought somewhere beyond their small island. The leaflets kept coming throughout the 1950s and 1960s. Each new batch was more elaborate than the last. They included photographs of modern Japan, newspaper clippings, letters from the holdouts' families, anything that might convince them the war had truly ended. Onoda examined each leaflet meticulously. He found flaws in all of them. This photograph was obviously doctored. That newspaper was clearly forged. These letters from family members were too perfectly written, obviously scripted by American intelligence trying to deceive them. Every piece of evidence that the war had ended was reinterpreted as evidence of how badly Japan must be losing to require such elaborate American deception operations. This was classic confirmation bias in action. Onoda had started with a conclusion that the war was ongoing and interpreted all new evidence to support that conclusion. Any evidence suggesting the war had ended was automatically dismissed as propaganda. The more elaborate the evidence, the more suspicious it seemed. The Philippine and Japanese governments couldn't win. If they sent simple leaflets, Onoda dismissed them as crude propaganda. If they sent sophisticated evidence, he dismissed it as proof of American desperation. There was no amount of evidence that could penetrate this worldview. Onoda had locked himself into a mental prison as secure as any physical prison, and he had thrown away the key. The psychological mechanisms at work here are fascinating and tragic. Onoda wasn't stupid. He wasn't mentally ill. He was intelligent, rational, and logical within his own framework. The problem was that his framework was fundamentally flawed. He had elevated following orders above evaluating reality. He had made obedience more important than observation. This is what happens when military discipline becomes absolute, when following orders becomes more important than understanding why those orders exist. Onoda's training had taught him to obey regardless of circumstances. His circumstances had changed, but his obedience hadn't. The result was a man fighting a war that existed only in his mind, while creating very real casualties in the real world. Throughout the 1960s, Onoda and Kozupa continued their operations. They had perfected their survival techniques by this point. They could evade searchers indefinitely. They knew how to maintain their weapons with improvised parts. They made bullets last by avoiding unnecessary fights. They were the ultimate guerrilla warriors, except they were fighting for a cause that no longer existed, against enemies who wanted to help them, not harm them. The tragedy wasn't just that they were lost. The tragedy was that they were so well trained that they couldn't find their way back. October 1972 marked another devastating loss. Private Kozuka was killed in a firefight with Philippine police. Onoda was suddenly alone, completely alone. For the first time since 1945, he had no comrades, no fellow soldiers, no one who shared his reality. This isolation could have broken him. It could have forced him to reconsider his beliefs. Instead, it hardened his resolve. Kazuka had died fighting for Japan. Onoda would honor that sacrifice by continuing the mission alone. One man could still fight. One man could still matter. One man could still make a difference in this war he believed was ongoing. Kazuka's death brought renewed international attention to the Lubang holdout situation. A Japanese soldier was still fighting 27 years after the war ended. This was news. This was incredible. This was tragic. The Japanese government renewed efforts to contact Onoda. They sent his family members to the island. They sent former comrades. They dropped leaflets with updated photographs showing modern Japan, showing his aged parents, showing proof that the world had moved on. Onoda saw all of this. He read everything. He examined every photograph. His conclusion remained unchanged. This was propaganda. Elaborate, sophisticated, well-funded propaganda, but propaganda nonetheless. The mission continued. Early 1974 brought an unlikely protagonist to this story. Norio Suzuki was a young Japanese adventurer who had set himself a peculiar goal: to find Lieutenant Onoda, a panda, and the abominable snowman in that order. This sounds absurd, but Suzuki was serious. He traveled to Lubang Island in February 1974 with camping equipment and enough determination to actually succeed where governments had failed. Within 4 days of arriving, he encountered Onoda in the jungle. The meeting was surreal. Suzuki wasn't military, wasn't government, wasn't trying to capture anyone. He was just a young civilian who wanted to meet the legendary holdout. Onoda was initially suspicious, but Suzuki's obvious civilian status and his genuine lack of agenda disarmed him. They talked. For hours they talked. Suzuki explained that the war had truly ended nearly 30 years ago. Japan had surrendered. The country had been rebuilt. Everything had changed. Onoda listened carefully. He considered Suzuki's words. He appreciated Suzuki's honesty. But his conclusion remained the same. He couldn't surrender without orders from Major Taniguchi. That was his mission. Those were his orders. Nothing else mattered. However, Onoda made Suzuki a promise. If Major Taniguchi came personally to Lubang and ordered him to surrender, he would obey immediately. This was the breakthrough everyone needed. Suzuki returned to Japan with photographs of Onoda and this crucial information. The Japanese government quickly located Major Taniguchi, who was now an elderly bookseller living a quiet civilian life. They explained the situation. They asked him to travel to Lubang to formally relieve Lieutenant Onoda of his duties. Taniguchi agreed. He had given the original orders in 1944. He would give the final orders in 1974. March 9, 1974. Major Taniguchi arrived on Lubang Island wearing his old uniform, carrying his military credentials, and bringing the official orders that would end Onoda's war. He walked into the jungle accompanied by Suzuki and Philippine officials. At a pre-arranged location, Onoda stepped out of hiding. For the first time in nearly 3 decades, he stood before his commanding officer. Taniguchi read the orders aloud. Formal military orders relieving Lieutenant Onoda of his duties, terminating his mission, and directing him to surrender to Philippine authorities. These were the orders Onoda had been waiting for. These were the only orders that mattered. Onoda listened to every word. When Taniguchi finished reading, Onoda saluted. The war was over. His mission was complete. He had followed his orders to the absolute letter for 29 years, 4 months, and 24 days. He had survived when everyone else had died or surrendered. He had maintained military discipline when it would have been easier to quit. He had done everything asked of him and more. Now his commanding officer was telling him to stop, so he would stop, immediately, completely, without question. That's what following orders meant. The surrender ceremony was formal and respectful. Onoda presented his sword to Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos in a traditional military surrender. He turned over his rifle, his ammunition, his equipment, everything he had hoarded and maintained for 3 decades. He bowed deeply. He apologized for the deaths he had caused. He explained he believed he was following orders, fighting a war, serving his country. The Filipinos were remarkably gracious. President Marcos pardoned him for all crimes committed during his holdout. The Japanese government thanked him for his service and his dedication. Everyone treated him as a hero rather than a criminal. This grace was undeserved but deeply appreciated. Onoda returned to Japan to a hero's welcome. Thousands of people greeted him at the airport. The media covered his story extensively. The emperor received him personally and acknowledged his service. Japan celebrated him as the ultimate example of loyalty, of duty, of dedication to orders regardless of personal cost. This celebration felt strange to Onoda. He had just spent 30 years fighting for a Japan that no longer existed. He returned to find a completely different country, peaceful, prosperous, democratic, allied with the United States he had spent decades fighting. This wasn't the Japan he remembered. This wasn't the Japan he fought for. This was something entirely new. The culture shock was profound and overwhelming. Onoda had left Japan in 1944 when it was a militaristic empire fighting for survival. He returned to find it was a pacifist democracy enjoying unprecedented prosperity. The technology alone was bewildering. Television, jets, cars everywhere, buildings taller than he remembered. The social changes were even more disorienting. Women had rights. Young people questioned authority. No one talked about dying for the emperor anymore. Everything that had been important in 1944 was irrelevant in 1974. Everything Onoda had fought for had become obsolete. He had won nothing and lost everything in a war that had ended before his fighting even began. The psychological toll became evident quickly. Onoda struggled to adapt to civilian life. He found modern Japan too soft, too comfortable, too forgetful of the sacrifices made during the war. He couldn't relate to people his own age who had moved on decades ago. He couldn't connect with younger generations who saw the war as ancient history. He was a man out of time, a warrior without a war, a soldier without a mission. This identity crisis led him to make a dramatic decision. In 1975, just 1 year after his return, Onoda emigrated to Brazil. He bought a cattle ranch and lived quietly away from modern Japanese society that confused and disturbed him. Brazil provided what Onoda needed most: distance from the Japan he no longer recognized, and space to process 30 years of lost time. On his ranch, he could live simply, work hard, and avoid confronting how much the world had changed. He married, raised cattle, and generally tried to build a normal life despite everything that had happened. He stayed in Brazil for 10 years before slowly beginning to engage with Japan again. In 1984, he returned to establish a nature school for Japanese youth, teaching survival skills and self-reliance to a generation he thought had grown too dependent on comfort and technology. His later life showed remarkable adaptation despite the earlier struggles. Onoda eventually came to terms with modern Japan, while never fully accepting it. He wrote his memoir, gave occasional interviews, and served as a living reminder of the war's long shadow. He maintained that he had no regrets about his actions, that he had simply been following orders as any good soldier would. This lack of regret troubled some people. He had killed 30 innocent Filipinos while fighting a war that had already ended. He had wasted 30 years of his life for nothing. How could he have no regrets? But Onona's perspective was different. From his viewpoint, he had followed his orders perfectly. He had done his duty. He had demonstrated loyalty beyond what anyone could have expected. The fact that his fighting was ultimately pointless didn't change the fact that he had done everything asked of him and more. This is the tragedy of absolute obedience. Even when it's pointed in the wrong direction, it's still absolute. Even when it serves no purpose, it's still service. Even when it creates suffering instead of preventing it, it's still dedication to orders received and followed to the letter. The broader context of Onoda's story reveals he wasn't alone in his extended holdout. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers remained hidden across Pacific Islands well into the 1950s and beyond. Some surrendered in 1946 or 1947. Others held out for years longer. Corporal Shioki Yokoi was discovered in Guam in 1972, having hidden for 28 years. Private Teruo Nakamura surrendered in Indonesia in 1974, also having fought for nearly 30 years. These weren't isolated cases of mental illness or individual delusion. They were the logical outcome of training that emphasized obedience over independent thought, duty over survival, and loyalty over reason. The Japanese military culture of the 1940s created these situations through its absolute emphasis on never surrendering. Death before dishonor wasn't just a slogan, it was official policy. Soldiers were taught that surrender was the ultimate shame, worse than death, unforgivable under any circumstances. When the emperor announced Japan's surrender, he created an impossible contradiction for soldiers like Onoda. How do you reconcile never surrender with surrender now? How do you accept that dying for the emperor is no longer required when you were taught it was the only honorable option? Many soldiers resolved this contradiction by deciding the surrender announcement must be fake. It was easier to believe the emperor had been coerced or that this was American propaganda than to accept that everything they believed was wrong. Modern analysis of Onoda's psychology reveals fascinating insights into confirmation bias, cognitive dissonance, and the power of ideological commitment. Once Onoda committed to the belief that the war was ongoing, every piece of contrary evidence became something he had to explain away rather than evidence he should accept. This is how intelligent people can believe obviously false things, not through stupidity, but through the motivated reasoning that protects cherished beliefs from uncomfortable truths. Onoda needed to believe his fighting mattered. If the war had truly ended in 1945, then everything he did afterward was meaningless murder. He couldn't accept that, so he didn't. He constructed an alternative reality where his actions made sense, where his loyalty was rewarded, where his sacrifice meant something. The legacy of Onoda's story remains complex and contested. To some, he represents the ultimate example of loyalty and dedication, a man who followed orders beyond all reasonable limits, and maintained his honor despite impossible circumstances. To others, he represents the dangers of blind obedience, showing how following orders without questioning them can lead to tragedy for everyone involved. Both interpretations have merit. Both capture different aspects of his story. The truth is probably that Onoda was both hero and cautionary tale, both admirable and problematic, both impressive and tragic. The Filipino victims of his guerrilla war deserve acknowledgement in this story. 30 people died because one man couldn't accept that circumstances had changed. Hundreds more were terrorized, injured, or had their property destroyed. These weren't military casualties in a legitimate conflict. They were civilians caught in one man's private war against reality. President Marcos's pardon was gracious and probably politically necessary, but it didn't undo the harm. Those families lost loved ones to a war that had already ended. That loss can't be justified by loyalty to obsolete orders. This is perhaps the most important lesson from Onoda's story, that dedication and loyalty, no matter how impressive, don't excuse the harm caused when they're directed toward destructive ends. Hiroo Onoda died in Tokyo on January 16, 2014, at age 91. He had lived 40 years after his surrender, long enough to see Japan become one of the world's most peaceful and prosperous nations, long enough to see his story become legendary, and long enough to reflect on what his 30-year war had meant and cost. In his final interviews, he maintained his position. He had followed his orders, he had done his duty, and he had no regrets about his service, even if he regretted the harm caused to innocent Filipinos. This consistency is either admirable or troubling depending on perspective. Either way, it defined who Onoda was until the very end. If stories like Onoda's matter to you, if understanding loyalty's limits matters, if learning from history's extremes matters, then subscribe to the Foxhole Chronicles. We tell forgotten stories every week, stories that deserve remembering, examining, and learning from. Heroes and cautionary tales, triumphs and tragedies, everything that makes history worth studying. Onoda's story is one among many more coming in every episode. Subscribe and stay with us. Keep these memories alive together. This is Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda, the Japanese soldier who fought until 1974, who didn't know or couldn't accept that World War II had ended in 1945, who killed 30 people defending an island that needed no defense, who followed orders so completely that he couldn't recognize when those orders had become obsolete. His story teaches us about loyalty's dark side, about obedience without wisdom, about dedication without perspective. It shows how the same qualities that make great soldiers, discipline, loyalty, dedication to mission, can become dangerous when divorced from changing circumstances and moral reasoning. Onoda was trained at the Japan's elite Nakano School to wage guerrilla warfare indefinitely, to never surrender under any circumstances, to follow orders regardless of cost. He did exactly that for 29 months, 24 days, and 4 months. He watched 3 comrades die, survived countless dangers, endured unimaginable hardship, and maintained absolute military discipline throughout. When Major Taniguchi finally ordered him to surrender in March 1974, Onoda complied immediately, completely, without question. That's who he was, a man who followed orders above all else, a man whose identity was built on obedience, a man who couldn't exist outside the military framework that defined him. The 30 Filipinos he killed, the families he terrorized, the decades he wasted fighting a war that existed only in his mind. These are the costs of absolute obedience without moral reasoning, of loyalty without wisdom, of dedication without questioning. Onoda never meant to harm innocents. He thought he was fighting legitimate military targets in an ongoing war. But good intentions don't eliminate bad outcomes. His intentions were honorable within his framework. His outcomes were tragic in reality. This disconnect between internal logic and external truth is what makes his story both fascinating and horrifying. We remember Onoda not to celebrate him or condemn him, but to understand what his story teaches about military training that emphasizes obedience over independent thought, about ideological commitment that resists contrary evidence, about how intelligent people can believe obviously false things when those beliefs serve psychological needs, about how heroic qualities in one context become destructive qualities in another context, about why following orders must always be balanced with moral reasoning and situational awareness. These lessons matter. They apply beyond World War II, beyond Onoda's specific case, to any situation where people are asked to obey without questioning, to commit without evaluating, to follow without understanding why. This is Hiroo Onoda's story. Complete, complex, true. A story of loyalty pushed beyond reason, of dedication divorced from reality, of obedience that couldn't adapt when circumstances changed. A story that makes us question what it means to be a good soldier, what loyalty requires and what it should never require, what following orders means and what it should never mean. A story that reminds us that the same qualities can be virtues or vices depending on context, wisdom, and willingness to adapt when the world changes around us. Forever remembered, forever debated, forever teaching us about war's long shadows and human nature's complexities.